HBO released a new documentary a couple of months ago called Persona, The Dark Truth About Personality Tests. This is relevant to reentry because in the documentary, there's a group in New York who is focused on helping people who come out of prison find work. HBO released a new documentary a couple of months ago called Persona, The Dark Truth About Personality Tests. In the documentary, a reentry group is featured in New York. This is a company that helps people coming out of prison find work. And as a part of their reentry curriculum, the reentry classes, they teach people about the fact that employers are using personality assessments in order to make decisions about who they might hire. According to them, people who are formerly incarcerated, people who are just released from prison, don't do too well on these assessments and have a poor time getting a job if they have to go through these tests. One of the things they're doing is not only teaching people about the personality assessments, but they're teaching them how employers are using them, and they're teaching them, and this is key, they're teaching them strategies on how to answer these assessments well in a way that will be more likable and appreciated by an employer. I find this a little bit problematic, and I'll explain why. To begin with, I want to clarify that I think personality assessments are really important for self-discovery and also for understanding others, especially in the workplace, but also relationships you have with your family and friends, your partner, whoever it might be. These personality assessments, I think, are reliable and valid ways of understanding yourself and others. However, the documentary brings up some important points about how these things are being used. One of the things it does is focus almost exclusively on the Myers-Briggs personality assessment. Many of you are probably familiar with the Myers-Briggs. It gives you a personality type that comes out with letters like ESTJ. These things are really popular on Facebook, online, in the workplace, in schools, and they focus a lot on how the Myers-Briggs assessment was developed, primarily by focusing on one person who is the originator of the Myers-Briggs assessment. By focusing on the originator of the assessment, they try to make it out as if the assessment itself is invalid or unreliable. One way they do this is by saying that the originator of the assessment was a racist who had written a racist novel, and then conclude that the assessment itself is in some way racially biased. This is actually a big part of the documentary. Number one, to focus on the Myers-Briggs personality assessment in particular, and number two, to make it out as if the assessment itself is racially biased. One person in the documentary emphasizes that the personality assessments, not just Myers-Briggs, but personality assessments generally, are racist, sexist, classist, ableist, and a couple of other isms I haven't heard of. Here are just two problems with that. Number one, although it's logically possible that the originator's own racial biases were imported into the assessment, that sort of thing can be rooted out, excluded over time by other researchers independently reviewing the reliability and validity of the assessment. The origin of an idea, the origin of an invention or creation is not necessarily connected to its validity and reliability. Sometimes it is, but they don't spend a lot of time actually making that case. But here's the real problem. It's not common practice for psychologists to make use of the Myers-Briggs assessment in empirical research. There are other personality assessments available, and the Myers-Briggs is just one that is popular in the workplace. It's not one psychologists are using in their actual empirical research, and that's the glaring problem. The one that psychologists mostly use in empirical research is called the Big Five, also sometimes called the Big Six, because in the last 20 years there's been a sixth component added to it. The Big Five is also seen, like on Facebook and different places in social media, as OCEAN. The OCEAN stands for each major personality trait discovered in the Big Five assessment. Hexaco is the acronym for the Big Six personality assessment. These are the ones that are actually used by psychologists in their empirical research, not the Myers-Briggs. I'm pretty sure the producers knew that, which is why they focus almost exclusively on the Myers-Briggs as opposed to the Big Five and the Big Six, because they couldn't make the same argument for those two. The Big Five, the Big Six, were ones that were discovered inductively through a study of language across the world, and the same personality traits were more or less discovered by independent researchers over the last 100 years. This is really significant because that is not how the Myers-Briggs was developed. They focus on one independent researcher and her racist origins, and then try to conclude that all personality assessments are in some way racist. When in reality, the assessment that researchers actually used was developed by independent researchers across the globe over the last 100 years. That's the first point to note. Mark Leary, a researcher at Duke University, has said that personality researchers almost never talk about types because true personality types almost never exist. Just to clarify again, I think that personality assessments are good for self-discovery and also for understanding other people, especially in the context of the workplace. The documentary does emphasize one important point, and this brings us back to that reentry group. This reentry group may not be guilty of some of the things I'm going to say, but just as far as the documentary is concerned, this is how it makes it out. It makes it out as if the people who are trying to help formerly incarcerated people are teaching them how to game the system. They're teaching them some sort of a strategy to pass these assessments in a way that will be more appreciated and likable to an employer. Well, if you know what personality assessments are, if you lie on them, if you game the system, it's going to come out once you get the job. It's not really productive for you as a person, it's not productive for the formerly incarcerated person, and it's not productive for the employer either. This is like teaching somebody how to pass an ethics test by lying just to give them the right answers that people want to hear. At least that's how the documentary makes it out. I hope that's not the case. I think the more productive way to go about this would be to teach people coming out of prison what personality theory is, how these assessments are being used, how they relate to different jobs, and why employers are using them the way that they are. Now, the important question that the documentary brings up, though, is who has the right to have that kind of information? That's the huge point that I think is valid. That's the point that should be open for discussion. Do they have the right to know those personal psychological characteristics about you in order to make a decision about a hiring? From the employer's perspective, it would not be productive to hire somebody who doesn't fit with the environment and needs of the job. But the issue goes both ways, and this is where I think people need to be counseled. You don't want to get into a job that you're not going to flourish in, that you're not going to excel in, that you're not going to do well or be comfortable in. Look, if you're an introvert, someone who is low in extroversion, if you don't like talking to a lot of people, you're not going to be great as a salesman. Now, this gets into a larger discussion because you can actually change some of these personality traits over time and with a lot of effort. But unless you know and understand personality theory and how to go about doing that and why you might want to change your personality, it's just not the norm that people are working towards changing certain personality types. And so I think this is why people put them in the same class as immutable characteristics. I think this is probably why that person claimed that personality assessments are racist, classist, sexist, ableist, and all this other stuff, is because personality traits seem to fit into that category of immutable characteristics, but they're not. So this is a complex issue. This is a valuable discussion, I think, that the documentary brings up, is who has the right to know that information? How can employers use this information to make decisions about a candidate? Because this information has been abused, not only by employers, but by politicians, for example, in the scandal a couple of years ago, and how people were using that data that they gathered from places like Facebook and social media. So just to clarify one last time, I think that the personality assessments are great as a tool for self-discovery, for understanding other people, for understanding humanity generally, and I encourage people to understand and learn about personality theory, learn about themselves and others. However, who has the right to have that information, how that information can be used, is a really important subject to discuss. It's valuable. In terms of reentry, I think it's important that we prepare people coming out of prison to understand all of this that's going on and what they can do to learn more about it. But I don't think we should give people the impression that personality assessments as a rule are racist, sexist, ableist, classist, and all the other isms they made it out to be.